Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Steve, and in New Hampshire. Keep skipping. Yehudit in South Carolina. Shandora in the Bronx. Melissa in Great Neck. Joe in the Inland Empire. Belle in Texas. Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Nancy in North Carolina, Frank in San Pedro, Alan in New York City, Ilanit in Silver Spring, Spencer in Connecticut, Ella in Southern California, Michael in Texas. Welcome, everybody. If you're enduring the bitter cold, may the light of Torah warm you up in our class. And all kidding aside, I hope that you're safe and warm. Our daf today is page 28 here in Tractate Sanhedrin, the 24th volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 4, relatives who are, or people who are disqualified from testifying, either because the two witnesses are related to each other or because they're related to one of the litigants. Disqualified. So what constitutes a relative? What constitutes a relation? That's what we are discussing. We'll be getting a little bit into the weeds today, and that's good. Let's try to keep it straight in our heads like our sages did. And I'll be sharing some charts to help us understand these relationships. Grandfathers and fathers and sons, sons-in-law, aunts and uncles, spouses of grandparents, etc. We'll just try to keep it straight. Top of page 28a. The Gemara resumes its discussion of the source for the disqualification of relatives from bearing witness. How do we know that relatives are disqualified from bearing witness, either because they're related to the litigants or related to each other? How do we know? What's the source in Torah? From the fact that the verse in Deuteronomy 24:16, the fathers shall not be put to death for the children, is not phrased in the singular, i.e., it doesn't say a father shall not be put to death for his child. Rather, it says fathers shall not be put to death for their children. Since we could have got the same meaning just with respect to fathers and children, or father and child, the plural on the top and bottom, so to speak, is there to teach us an extra law. So since it is not phrased in the singular, i.e. a father shall not be put to death for his child, from this we derive that not only are a father and child disqualified from bearing witness about one another, but closely related relatives, i.e. brothers, are also disqualified from bearing witness about each other's children. All right, can't bear witness about their nephews, presumably the nephews about the uncles. So consequently, we found a source for the disqualification of fathers from bearing witness about their children or the children of their brothers, and for the disqualification of children from bearing witness about their fathers or their fathers' brothers, i.e. their uncles. And all the more so, the related fathers, for example, brothers, are disqualified from bearing witness about each other. If you can't bear witness against your uncle, certainly your father cannot bear witness against your uncle, because that's your father bearing witness against his brother. But from where do we derive that one brother's children cannot bear witness about the children of the other brother? You cannot bear witness against your first cousins. How do we know that? And the Gemara answers, if so, if the children of one brother cannot bear witness about the children of the other brother, let the verse write, the fathers shall not be put to death for the child. For what reason is children written in the plural? It is derived from here that even children of brothers are disqualified from bearing witness about each other. Cousins cannot bear witness against their cousins. We found a source for the law that the children of brothers cannot bear witness about each other. From where do we derive that the children of brothers cannot bear witness together about others? So cousins cannot come together and be two witnesses in a case about, some other unrelated person, right? Now we're talking about the two witnesses can't be related to each other. They can't even be cousins of each other. So obviously they can't be brothers or father and son. How do we know that two witnesses who are going to testify in somebody's case, that those two witnesses can't be each other's cousin? How do we know? Rami Bar Chama says this law is based on logical reasoning and is not derived from a verse in the Torah. And this is as it is taught in a Baraisa. The witnesses are not rendered conspiring witnesses unless they are both rendered conspiring witnesses. Now, this is what we were talking about yesterday, where I admit I got a little bit flustered because I was confused. Because what, we said, well, what if one of them, right? So there were two witnesses that say, we saw Joe on Monday at noon on Main Street rob a bank, right? These two witnesses were there and they saw that. Now, let's say that Joe, who's the defendant, brings two witnesses, and let's say that the two witnesses were Reuben and Shimon. So now Joe brings two witnesses, Dan and Asher, and Dan and Asher say, well, we know that Shimon wasn't there at noon on Monday on Main Street because he was with us in another town. Now, Shimon would be rendered a conspiring witness in the sense that he has perjured himself in what he gave testimony about what he saw when he could not have been there. But that Dan and Asher only testified about Shimon. They didn't say that they saw Reuben in some other place. So two witnesses, if one of them is proven by the testimony of other people that he wasn't there, the two witnesses now, Reuben and Shimon, they're not rendered conspiring witnesses. We might discredit their testimony, but we're not going to say that the two of them are now going to be subject to the same punishment that the defendant would have been subject to if they hadn't conspired against him. Conspiring witnesses only become conspiring witnesses when both of them are rendered conspiring witnesses. Okay, we need that in place for what follows. Right? Witnesses are not rendered conspiring witnesses unless they are both rendered conspiring witnesses. And therefore, if it enters your mind that related children are fit to bear witness together about others, a conspiring witness can be found to be executed based on the testimony of his brother, i.e. his relative, since a conspiring witness is executed for his testimony only if his co-witness is also rendered a conspiring witness. The testimony of his co-witness, who is a relative, is what causes him to be executed. And this is tantamount to relatives bearing witness about each other. Therefore, relatives cannot serve as witnesses together. Now, this is interesting, right? They're saying since they cannot be rendered conspiring witnesses unless both of them are conspiring witnesses, and if they were related, then the fact that you need this other guy to also be a conspiring witness with you, and if he was related to you, it would come out that he was, in a sense, responsible for you being executed. And we know that a relative can't testify against his relative, certainly in a capital case and also in monetary cases. And since they would need to go together, if we allowed witnesses to be related to each other, then in a sense, it's like one of them would be testifying about the other, not because he's testifying, but because they have to go together. That's the kind of connection they're making. So Rava said to him, wait a minute. According to your reasoning, there is a difficulty arising from that which we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Bava Basra, page 56b. And this was a case where we establish a hazaka of ownership, right? So if a person has been living on a piece of land or farming a certain field for 3 years, uninterrupted, and he has a valid story of how he acquired the land, then even if he can't show his deed of purchase because, for example, he lost it, but he was in continuous ownership of that land for 3 years, and nobody objected until now in the 4th year. This guy who was, let's say, the previous owner of that field comes and says, hey, I didn't sell it to him. That's still my land. Well, you should have objected during 3 years. Since you didn't object during 3 years, he now has the presumption of ownership, and you're going to have to prove. The burden of proof is now on you to say he shouldn't be on the land because he has that presumption of ownership. And that's only if the guy who was on the land for 3 years can establish as a legal matter that he was on that land or farming that field for 3 years. Meaning he has to bring witnesses that testify, yeah, this guy was there for 3 years. Now, what he needs is witnesses that show he was on that land for 3 years. It may not be possible to bring one pair of witnesses who could say, we are aware that he was there for all 3 years. Because maybe the next door neighbors, they moved out after 1 year and new neighbors moved in the 2nd year. So you could have 2 witnesses say that, well, we saw him living there the 1st year. And then you could bring 2 more witnesses that say, yeah, we saw him living there the 2nd year. And perhaps a 3rd pair of witnesses who say, we saw him living there the 3rd year. So now you have 6 witnesses in 3 pairs of witnesses, but altogether they can say, yeah, we saw that guy farming that field for 3 continuous years. And then we would have established the continuous ownership. We don't need one pair of witnesses to testify as to all 3 years that he occupied the land. Okay, that was what we said in Tractate Bava Basra. Now, what if those 3 pairs of witnesses, 3 of the people involved are brothers? Now, 3 brothers. Now, 3 brothers can never come, 2 brothers can never come as a pair of witnesses. They can't be related to each other. But can you have 3 brothers, each of whom can testify as to 1 year that, Reuben was living on that land, and each of those 3 brothers has another witness to be the pair, the second half of the pair. In other words, let's say there was a neighbor who lived there during that whole period of time, all 3 years. So he can be the second person in the pair for each of the 3 years. And then these 3 brothers, let's say these 3 brothers, Dan, Asher, and Benjamin, they occupied another house on that street, and each one lived there for 1 year. And they saw that this guy Reuben was out farming that field. They can only testify as to one of the years, but for each of the years, one of those brothers can combine with this unrelated guy who lived across the street, and therefore we have 3 pairs of witnesses to testify about the 3 years of continuous use of that field. In each of those pairs, there's one person who's there in all 3 pairs, and the other half of the pair is 3 brothers, each of whom testifies as to one of those years. So what happens there? If one occupied land for 3 years, this serves in court as proof that he is the legal owner. If 3 brothers testify to his 3-year possession of the land, with each one testifying separately about 1 year, and one unrelated individual joins with each of the brothers as the second witness, these are considered 3 distinct testimonies and are therefore accepted by the court. If they were to be considered one testimony, it would not be accepted, as brothers may not testify together. That's why there's 3 separate testimonies, one about each of the years. But they would all be considered, right, there's 3 pairs of witnesses, they would be considered one testimony for purpose of rendering them conspiring witnesses. In other words, if the previous owner of that field, he brought witnesses who could say that all 4 of these people, the 3 brothers and the other unrelated person, were all liars because none of them lived on that street and none of them could have seen this, and he's got witnesses to prove that, then all 4 of them would be rendered conspiring witnesses. Now, if they're conspiring witnesses, they're going to bear the liability that the defendant would have borne if they hadn't lied, right? So they have to pay for the field or pay the rent or whatever the damages would have been. It would all fall on the conspiring witnesses. Since you have one guy who's part of all 3 pairs of witnesses, and then the 3 brothers who are each, for half of each one of those 3 pairs, so that one unrelated guy would have half the liability, and the 3 brothers would have half the liability of the total damages. That's what we learn here. The question is how we're going to apply that to how we can prove that brothers cannot serve as witnesses together. Let's see. So they are considered one testimony for the purpose of rendering conspiring witnesses. In other words, they are punished only if all 6 of the witnesses are rendered conspiring witnesses and the liability is divided among them. That's if you had the unrelated individual. That could be 3 different individuals also, or it could be 1 for all 3 years. Now, Rava states the objection to what we're learning today from that teaching in Bava Basra. If so, a conspiring witness can be found to be paying money due to the testimony of his brother, right? Since they're all taken as one big set of conspiring witnesses that could include 3 brothers, sounds like brothers can testify together, according to that understanding of what we just said. So rather, this is clearly not considered tantamount to brothers bearing witness with each other, as the rendering of one as a conspiring witness comes not from his co-witness, but rather from others, i.e. the witnesses who testified that he had been with them. So here too, it cannot be proven logically that relatives are disqualified from bearing witness together, as the rendering of one as a conspiring witness comes from others. Right? So we know that 2 brothers cannot act as a pair of witnesses to establish a matter. The question is, have we found a source for that yet? No, because in these proofs that have to do with conspiring witnesses, there was an unrelated person. There were totally unrelated people who came and established them as conspiring witnesses. And that whole setup is not going to act as a proof that 2 brothers can't act as a pair of witnesses together. So, rather, the halakha, the law that relatives are disqualified from bearing witness together, being a pair of witnesses, as 2 relatives cannot be a pair of witnesses to establish a matter, we derive this from a different source. If it is so that relatives can bear witness together, let the verse write, and a child shall not be put to death for the fathers, or they shall not be put to death for the fathers. For what reason is "and the children" written in the plural? This indicates that related children are disqualified from bearing witness even about others. 2 relatives cannot act as a pair of witnesses even about unrelated people. The Gemara asks, we found a source for the disqualification of paternal relatives, right? That I cannot testify against my father's brother, and my father's brother cannot testify against me. From where do we derive the disqualification of maternal relatives? How do we know that I cannot testify against my mother's brother and he cannot testify against me? And the Gemara answers, the verse states fathers, i.e. it states the word fathers twice. And this repetition is unnecessary, as the verse could have stated, and the children shall not be put to death for them, since we just said fathers shall not be put to death for their children, and children shall not be put to death for them. Since it says fathers again, what do we learn out from that? If the superfluous word fathers is not needed to teach the matter of paternal relatives, as this matter was already derived from the verse, apply it to the matter of maternal relatives. Gemara asks, we found a source for the law that one cannot bear witness to the detriment of his relative, as the verse states, shall not be put to death. From where do we derive that one cannot testify to the benefit of his relative? And the Gemara answers, the verse states the term shall not be put to death twice. If it is not needed to teach the matter of testimony to the detriment of one's relative, as this law was already derived from the verse, apply it to the matter of testimony to the benefit of one's relative. The Gemara asks, we found a source for the disqualification of relatives in cases of capital laws, as the verse is referring to execution, shall not be put to death. From where do we derive this law in cases of monetary law? And the Gemara answers that the verse states, you shall have one manner of law, Leviticus 24:22, which is interpreted to mean a law that is equal for you. In other words, monetary law and capital law essentially follow the same guidelines. We might need 23 judges in order to execute someone and only 3 judges to establish monetary liability. But generally speaking, the rules of evidence are the same. Rav says, my paternal uncle will not testify about me, neither he nor his son-in-law, in accordance with the ruling of our Mishna. And furthermore, I will not testify about him, neither I nor my son nor my son-in-law. Now, when we get into these nice little charts, you see that there's all these dark figures and the one white figure or outline figure. And so you see that it's all from the perspective of the one that is in the outline, right? So above him is his father and his father's brother. And above that is the white guy's grandfather. Then over on the same level as him would be his cousin, his cousin's wife, and or his cousin and his male cousin and his female cousin and his female cousin's husband. And then his children, his son, his daughter, and his daughter's husband, right? So his son-in-law. So Rav is saying that all these people are disqualified from testifying against the outline figure, and the outline figure is disqualified from testifying against them. So the Gemara asks, and why, for example, can Rav's son not testify about the brother of his father's father, right? So now what you're saying is if Rav's son testified about his father's father, now are we talking about Rav's, are there 4 levels here? Yes, right? So if we're saying that Rav's son cannot testify against Rav's father's brother, so what would that be, right? Rav's son, okay, so from the point of view of Rav's son, so Rav is his father, then there's his grandfather, and then there's his great-grandfather, and then his great-grandfather's sibling, right? So that would be 4 generations up from the original guy in this question. So why couldn't he testify about that? Or if we're going to say we don't mean against Rav's father's father, we just mean in terms of Rav's son, his father is Rav, his father's father is his grandfather, and then his grandfather's sibling, what we would call a great uncle. So is a person disqualified from testifying against his great uncle, and is his great uncle disqualified from testifying against him? That's what we're examining. So and why, for example, can Rav's son not testify about the brother of his father's father? So I think we are talking about the great uncle. But it is testimony of a member of the 3rd generation with regard to a related member of the 1st generation. Okay, so they're 2 generations apart. Father, right? So let's call them grandfather, father, and son. Right? So the 1st generation, 2nd generation, the 3rd generation. Here we're looking at somebody from the grandchildren generation testifying against somebody from the grandfather generation. Why I say generations, because not against his grandfather, but against his grandfather's brother. So his great uncle. Okay? So, but it is a testimony of a member of the 3rd generation with regard to a related member of the 1st generation, as there is a 2-generation difference between them. And we learned in the Mishnah that a member of the 2nd generation cannot testify about a member of the 2nd generation. So this would mean you can't testify against your cousin. You're both in the 2nd generation. We also learned that a member of the 2nd generation cannot testify about a member of the 1st generation. It means you can't testify against your uncle. But we did not learn that a member of the 3rd generation cannot testify about a member of the 1st generation. Can you testify against your great uncle, and can he testify against you? We haven't learned that that's disqualified. Maybe it is, but we haven't learned the source yet. So the Gemara answers in the statement that is taught in our Mishnah, which said, they themselves and their sons-in-law are considered relatives. What is the ruling of the Mishnah concerning his son-in-law referring to? It is referring to the son-in-law of his son. right? So that means my granddaughter's husband, that would be my son's son-in-law. Sounds like our Mishnah did cover it and disqualify the members of this relationship from testifying against each other. The Gemara asks, but if so, let the Mishnah teach and his son and the son of his son instead of his son-in-law. This would be a more straightforward manner of conveying the law with regard to a member of the third generation testifying about a member of the first generation. And the Gemara answers by mentioning his son-in-law. The Mishnah teaches us a matter in passing, that with regard to the different levels of familial relationships, a husband is like his wife. Therefore, there is no difference between one's son and one's son-in-law with respect to these relationships that disqualify them from testifying together or testifying against each other. So the Gemara asks, but if the Mishnah is referring to the son-in-law of his son, a difficulty is posed by that which Rabbi Chia teaches in a Baraisa. 8 fathers, i.e., 8 principal relatives mentioned in the Mishnah are disqualified, which are 24 if we include the son and son-in-law of each. And if the Mishnah is referring to one's grandson, then we have 32, as the son, the son-in-law, and the grandson of each are included. So the Gemara consequently rejects the explanation that the Mishnah is referring to the son-in-law of one's son. Rather, the Mishnah is in fact referring to his actual son-in-law. And why does Rav refer to him as the son-in-law of his son? Deriving from this case that a member of the third generation cannot testify about a member of the first generation? Since one's son-in-law comes from outside the family, he is considered a more distant relative than his son, as if he belongs to another generation. And the Gemara challenges this. If that is so, then the testimony of an individual with regard to the son-in-law of his father, the son-in-law of his father, my father's son-in-law, well, that would be my brother-in-law, right? My father has a son-in-law, right? So unless I married a man, it means that my father has a daughter, my sister. She got married. And so my father's son-in-law, right, is like my brother-in-law. Can I testify against my brother-in-law? Can my brother-in-law testify against me? Sounds like no. Right. Where am I? Right, the Gemara challenges this. If that is so, then the testimony of an individual with regard to the son-in-law of his father is equivalent to that of a member of the third generation with regard to a member of the second generation. And Rav is known to have deemed a member of the third generation fit to bear witness about a member of the second generation. A little surprising, right? But here what we would be saying is, well, how would we do this, right? So we have grandpa, and let's say grandpa has a son and a daughter. And then each of the son and the daughter have several kids, right? So grandpa vis-a-vis his grandchildren. Now the second generation is the son and daughter. The third generation are their kids, right? And then let's say they get married, so there's sons-in-law, daughters-in-law. Are we going to say that we know that you can't testify against your uncle? We already established that. But we're saying that a third generation could testify about a second generation. So it's not uncle that could produce an uncle and a nephew, but they could also be further apart in the tree, right? And it could be like the husband of a woman who's and she has an uncle, right? So could a niece's husband testify against her uncle? That's what we're examining here. It seems like Rav would say yes, because they are far enough apart that it's not like a niece and her uncle. So, or rather, a nephew and his uncle, because women in this system don't testify, so that's why we're keeping it male-oriented. Now, rather, Rav stated his ruling not in accordance with the Mishnah, but in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Elazar says, just as my paternal uncle, okay, my father's brother, will not testify about me, neither he nor his son, that's my cousin, nor his son-in-law, right? My cousin who's a woman, her husband. So I can't testify against my cousin's husband, and he can't testify about me, according to Rabbi Elazar. And so too, the son of my paternal uncle, again my cousin, will not testify about me, neither he nor his son, nor his son-in-law. My cousin's son, right? My cousin's son, I think you would call that my first cousin once removed. And let's say he, or maybe my cousin's daughter, and she gets married. So now, right, my first cousin, once removed, her husband, can that guy testify against me or I against him? According to Rabbi Elazar, no. So the Gemara asks, but still, according to Rabbi Elazar, the grandson of one's uncle cannot testify about his great-great uncle, which is the testimony of a member of the third generation about a member of the second generation. And Rav deemed a member of the third generation fit to bear witness about a member of the second generation. So the Gemara answers that Rav holds in accordance with Rabbi Elazar's opinion in one case, i.e. he disqualifies testimony of a member of the third generation with regard to a member of the first generation, and he disagrees with him in one case, i.e. he does not disqualify the testimony of a member of the third generation about a member of the second generation. If there was any kind of familial relationship, and there was going to be in a case before a Beis Din, you ask an expert to tell you if that person could testify or not. It's very hard to memorize all of this, right? So we do the best we can. What is the reason for the opinion of Rav? It is as the verse states, the fathers shall not be put to death for the children, and the children shall not be put to death for the fathers. And the phrase for the children and the children is interpreted to include another generation. The grandchildren of one's brother, they are also disqualified. And Rabbi Elazar derives his opinion from the fact that the merciful one states for the children, which is interpreted to mean that that the ones disqualified from bearing witness about the fathers are cast on the children as well. In other words, anyone who's disqualified from bearing witness about a father is also disqualified from bearing witness about his children. Rav Nachman says, the brother of my mother-in-law will not testify about me. So my wife's mom, she has a brother, okay? He cannot testify against me. I can't testify against her. Also, the son of the brother of my mother-in-law will not testify about me. The son of the sister of my mother-in-law will not testify about me. And the Tana of the Mishna also taught this law. His sister's husband, and the husband of his father's sister, and the husband of his mother's sister, and his mother's husband, and his father-in-law, and his brother-in-law, they, themselves, and their sons-in-law, all are disqualified from testifying with or against each other. And this describes the same familial relationship from the perspective of the younger generation. So this little chart down here, again, from the perspective of the outline figure at the bottom, right? So that one has, that's a man, he has a wife, and then the wife's mother, right? And then she has a brother and a sister, and the brother and the sister have children, and that there's the father of his wife's mother, right? That would be his wife's grandfather. So these are the relationships we're talking about there. Okay. So Rav Ashi said, when we were in Ula's study hall, we were asked, with regard to testifying about the brother of one's father-in-law, what is the law? With regard to the son of the brother of one's father-in-law, what is the law? And with regard to the son of the sister of one's father-in-law, what is the law? And Ula said to us, you learn the answer to this question in the Mishnah. His brother, his paternal uncle, his maternal uncle, and his mother's husband, and his father-in-law, and his brother-in-law, they themselves, their sons, and their sons-in-law. These relationships are the same as those you are asking about from the perspective of the younger generation. Rav arrived at a certain place to buy scrolls of parchment. And they asked him there, what is the law as to whether a man can testify with regard to the wife of his stepson? And you can get the picture. Rav is just doing some shopping that he needs to do, for his own home. Let's say he's buying scrolls to make a mezuzah for one of the archways in his house. He's busy doing his own thing, and they say, oh, Rav, we got you for a few minutes. Can you answer this pressing matter? Can a man testify with regard to the wife of his stepson? So a man was married, and then he was divorced or widowed. He married a second time, and the new wife brings a child into the marriage from her first husband. Can he testify with regard to the stepson, his stepson, his wife's son that she brought into the marriage? We're on page 28b. In Surah, they say that Rav gave the following answer. A husband is considered like a wife. Since he is married to the son's mother, the son's wife is considered like his daughter-in-law, right? Oh, so exactly. So she brings a son into the marriage. That son is married. What about the son's wife? What about their child? What about the son's father-in-law? To the stepfather. Now it's starting to get pretty attenuated. In Pumbedisa, they say a different version of Rav's answer. A wife is considered like her husband. Therefore, the wife of his stepson is considered like his stepson, and he cannot testify about her. As Rav Huna says that Rav Nachman says, from where is it derived that a wife is considered like her husband? If you can't testify against the husband, you can't testify against the wife. As it is written, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. You shall not approach his wife. She is your aunt. That's Leviticus 18:14. There, it's talking about who is permitted for you to marry, who is prohibited for you to marry, because it's prohibited for you to have marital relations with such a person. You can't marry your aunt. So now that we've established that there's this erva, this prohibited relationship, we can also learn out from that a husband is like a wife. Isn't she the wife of his uncle and not his aunt, i.e. his father's sister? It can therefore be concluded by inference that a wife is considered like her husband. In other words, my father's sister, that's my aunt. Do I say that the wife of my father's brother is my aunt? I call her Aunt Susie, right? But is she actually my aunt? Not in the same way that my father's sister is my aunt, right? She's my aunt by blood. But if my father's brother marries Susie, a woman named Susie, and I call her my Aunt Susie, even though I'm not related to her, genetically, she is my aunt, and we have the same prohibitions of testifying against or with each other. Why? Because a husband is like his wife for the purposes of these laws, qualifying or disqualifying witnesses. New subject. The Mishna teaches that among, and by the way, the reason tonight's class is called Millie and Sillie, just in passing, I call my mother-in-law Millie. That's not her name, but mother-in-law, M-I-L, Millie. And she calls me Sillie, son-in-law, like S-I-L, Sillie. Right, so that's just a little gag that we have between us. Instead of calling her mother-in-law and she calling me son-in-law, I call her Millie and she calls me Sillie, and we have fun with that. Okay, the Mishnah teaches that among the relatives disqualified from testifying are his mother's husband, i.e. the mother's husband himself, and his son-in-law. So the Gemara challenges, the son of his mother's husband is the same as his brother, i.e. his half-brother, right? If we talk about my mother's husband, that would imply that he's not my father, right? So it must be that she remarried, and this would be my stepfather, okay? So we're talking about my stepfather, so I can't testify against my stepfather because I can't testify against my mom, and a husband and a wife are considered the same. And for that reason, I can't testify against my stepfather's son, which would be my stepbrother, nor his son-in-law. So that would be the husband of my stepsister. And the Gemara challenges, the son of his mother's husband is the same as his brother, i.e. his half-brother, and the Mishnah already stated that his brother is disqualified. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said, mentioning this case is necessary only for the half-brother of the half-brother, i.e. the son of his stepfather from another woman. Although they are not biologically related, they are considered close relatives. They are considered relatives. So that would be, I guess we're talking about Greg and Marcia Brady, right? They don't share a parent, right? Greg Brady's father and mother, neither one of them is biologically related to Marcia Brady, right? So he had two parents, she had two parents, and then, one of each of those parents had another marriage, and they became stepbrother and stepsister, even though they don't share neither a father nor a mother, but they're related now for the purposes of being disqualified as witnesses. Rav Chisda deemed the testimony of the half-brother fit. He says Greg and Marcia can testify against each other if Marcia was permitted to testify as a woman. The other sages said to him, did you not hear this statement of Rabbi Yirmiyah, that the half-brother of the half-brother is disqualified? Rav Chisda said to them, I did not hear this, as if to say, I do not hold in accordance with this opinion. And the Gemara asks, if so, the question asked above recurs. The son of his mother's father is the same as his brother. The Gemara answers, the Mishnah taught the case of a paternal half-brother, and it also teaches the case of a maternal half-brother. New subject. Rav Chisda says, the father of the groom and the father of the bride can testify about each other, and this is because they are considered to each other only like a lid on a barrel, which is not part of the barrel, but merely rests on top of it, right? So we have a term, is it Hebrew or Yiddish? Mechutanin. Somebody will let me know. I think it might be Yiddish. But the mechutanin, right? In English, we only have the term in-laws. And in-laws could refer to a few different things. But here we're talking about if my son marries Reuven's daughter, okay, well, are Reuven and I related? Our children married each other. There is this term, my mechutanin, right? So Reuven is my mechutanin. But we're not related at all, right? Other than the fact that our children married each other. Can we testify against each other? Can we testify with each other as a pair of witnesses? Rav Chisda says, yes. Yes, Reuven and I, my mechutanin, we can testify against each other or join together to be a pair of witnesses. Rabba Bar Bar Chana says, a man can testify about his betrothed wife. They are considered related only after marriage. Okay, so Kiddushin. Here under Jewish law, under Torah law, when a man and a woman get betrothed, that's not the same as getting engaged in the modern secular culture, right? Where you give a woman a ring, she agrees to marry you, now she's your fiancé, okay? So then if you change your minds, you don't want to get married, whether she keeps the ring or not, you go your separate ways. That's it. You're done. You have no obligations to her. She has none to you. This is a clean break. Once you get married, you would need a divorce. That's in secular law. Under Torah law, Jewish law, if you get betrothed, which is a legal status, where she agrees to marry you and you give her something of value, now you are betrothed. You have performed Kiddushin. Now, if you decide to break it off, you need to give her a bill of divorce. She needs a get before this relationship is severed. Even though you never went to the chuppah, even though you were not formally married, even though you did not consummate the betrothal, it requires a bill of divorce. What we're asking now is, does this betrothal that is not yet marriage create the same kinds of relationship for the purpose of witnesses and qualifying them or disqualifying them? So let's see. Rabba Bar Bar Chana says, a man can testify about his betrothed wife because they are considered related only after marriage. You can't testify against your spouse, but you could testify against your betrothed, according to Rabbah bar Chana. Ravina says, we said this law only for the testimony that removes money from her possession. But for testimony that awards her money, his testimony is not deemed credible, as he will ultimately marry her and he stands to benefit from this money. Right? So if his testimony was going to end in, no, she's not able to receive these damages, so that it would be to his detriment, we would believe his testimony. But to give testimony in which she would be awarded money in a litigation, we don't accept it because he's personally involved. He's betrothed to her, and ultimately she'll bring that money into their marriage. Now, the Gemara rejects this opinion, the difference between benefit and detriment. But that is not so. There is no difference whether the testimony removes money from her possession, and there is no difference whether it awards her money. In both cases, his testimony is not deemed credible. Betrothal is close enough to marriage. It requires a get to dissolve it, and we're going to say that he cannot testify against her or for her. He can't be a witness in her case. The Gemara explains, what is your thinking that you deem a man fit to bear witness concerning his betrothed wife? It is, as Rabbi Chia bar Ami said in the name of Ula, one does not enter acute mourning on the day of the death of his betrothed wife, nor may he become ritually impure to bury her if he is a Kohen. And similarly, she does not enter acute mourning for him and is not obligated to become ritually impure to bury him. If she dies, he does not inherit her property. If he dies, she collects payment of her marriage contract if he wrote it at the time of the betrothal, as it is treated like any other monetary document. But otherwise, a betrothed woman is not considered related to her husband, since there are all these laws that only kick in, like whether a Kohen can become tameh for his wife, or whether a man enters acute mourning the way he would for a wife. He doesn't do that if it's only the woman to whom he's betrothed when she dies. So since the laws are different in these other areas, that's why we would say they're not related, and therefore he could be a witness against her. That's the view that would say he is fit to bear witness. Now the Gemara comments, that law does not serve as a proof for the law of witness testimony, as there, with regard to becoming tameh or the like, the merciful one renders it dependent on the question of whether the woman is, quote, his kin, Leviticus 21:2. And a betrothed woman is not yet his kin, as they are not married. But here, with regard to testimony, it is due to a sense of affinity that he is disqualified, and one certainly does feel a sense of affinity toward his betrothed, and that's why we disqualify a person from bearing witness against his betrothed. Where did this end up? A betrothed man is disqualified from bearing witness about his betrothed wife-to-be, even though they are not yet married, due to his sense of affinity for her in accordance with the conclusion of the Gemara. He should not testify about her relatives ab initio, but his testimony is accepted after the fact. All of the above pertains to halachic betrothal. If they have merely agreed to marry but not exchanged an item of value, then he is not disqualified at all. New subject. The Mishna teaches that his stepson alone is disqualified from bearing witness about him, but not the sons of his stepson or the sons-in-law of his stepson. And the sages taught in a baraisa, his stepson alone is disqualified. And Rabbi Yosei says his brother-in-law. And it is taught in another baraisa, his brother-in-law alone is disqualified. Rabbi Yehuda says his stepson. So the Gemara asks, what does this baraisa say? If we say that this is what it is saying, his stepson alone is disqualified, and the same is true with regard to his brother-in-law, i.e. a brother-in-law alone is disqualified, but not the sons or sons-in-law of the brother-in-law. And Rabbi Yosei comes to say that his brother-in-law alone is disqualified, and the same is true with regard to his stepson, but that interpretation would be difficult, because if so, whose opinion is expressed in our Mishnah? which teaches that his brother-in-law is disqualified, and this disqualification applies to he himself and to his son and to his son-in-law. It is neither the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda nor the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, as they both agree that the son and son-in-law of one's brother-in-law are not disqualified. So rather, this is what the Baraisa is saying: his stepson alone is disqualified, but as for his brother-in-law, he himself and his son-in-law are disqualified. And Rabbi Yosef comes to disagree and say that his brother-in-law alone is disqualified, but as for his stepson, he himself and his son-in-law are disqualified. According to the Mishnah, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara asks, but then, in accordance with whose opinion is the Baraisa that Rabbi Chia teaches? That 8 fathers, which are the 8 principal relatives mentioned in our Mishnah, are disqualified, which are 24, including the son and son-in-law of each. It is neither in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef nor in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So rather, the above interpretation should be rejected. And this is what the Baraisa is saying: his stepson alone is disqualified, but as for his brother-in-law, he himself and his son-in-law are disqualified. And Rabbi Yosef comes to say that his brother-in-law alone is disqualified, excluding his son and son-in-law, and all the more so his stepson. And accordingly, the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and the Baraisa that Rabbi Chia taught is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. The Gemara relates: there was a certain deed of gift. Okay? A deed of gift. Somebody is giving a field to someone else, and to formalize this transaction, he's creating a deed, not of purchase, but of gift. There was a certain deed of gift on which 2 brothers-in-law were signed. Now, can a man join with his sister's husband, right? Or with his wife's brother, right? So his brother-in-law. Can he join with his brother-in-law and the 2 of them serve as witnesses on a document? Do we allow brothers-in-law to join together as witnesses? Sounds like we've said no already. Rav Yosef thought to deem it valid, as Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Rav Yosef assumed that Shmuel was referring to Rabbi Yosef's opinion, as cited in the Mishnah, that only relatives who are fit to inherit are disqualified, and one does not ever inherit from his brother-in-law, so he's not disqualified, and he could join with his brother-in-law to be witnesses on this deed of gift. But not everybody holds like that. So Abaye said to him, from where do you conclude that Shmuel was referring to Rabbi Yosef, as cited in the Mishnah, who deems one's brother-in-law fit to bear witness with or about him? Perhaps he was referring to Rabbi Yosef, as cited in the Baraisa, who deems one's brother-in-law, though not the latter's son and son-in-law, disqualified. Rabbi Yosef in the Baraisa would say, no, you can't join with your brother-in-law. Rabbi Yosef in the Mishnah, maybe, minority opinion, might allow this, but in the Baraisa it's not allowed. So which holding of Rabbi Yosef are we following? Rav Yosef answered, do not let it enter your mind that Shmuel was referring to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef as cited in the Baraisa. Why? Because Shmuel said, for example, my brother Pinchas and I are disqualified from bearing witness about one another. So apparently he meant to say we are disqualified because we are both brothers and brothers-in-law, as we married 2 sisters. Shmuel and Pinchas married, what do we call them? Rachel and Leah, right? They married 2 sisters. 2 brothers married 2 sisters. But by inference, other brothers-in-law may well testify about each other. Abaye was not buying it. Abaye raised an objection. Perhaps Shmuel said, for example, Pinchas and I are disqualified only because Pinchas was his brother-in-law. He did not mean to say that they were disqualified only because they were brothers. And due to Abaye's objection, Rav Yosef said to the one holding the deed of gift, since the witnesses signed on the document are disqualified from bearing witness together, go and acquire the gift by means of the witnesses who observe the transmission of the deed to you in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who maintains that the witnesses who effect the transaction are not those who signed the deed, but rather those who observe the transmission. A legal document is signed by witnesses merely to enhance its authority, not to effect the transaction. Here you have tremendous humility by Rav Yosef, who was the teacher of Abaye. It is also true that later in life, Rav Yosef forgot some of his learning, and he would rely on Abaye to remind him what he had taught Abaye earlier. But maybe that's not even what's going on here. It's just he's saying, oh, okay, got it. What you're saying makes sense, and I'm going to revise my ruling. Tremendous humility by the great Rav Yosef. And what he's saying is, since we're disqualifying the witnesses that are signed on the deed, at least we can still keep the deed of gift good because there were other witnesses who witnessed its transmission, and if we could bring them to court, we could establish that the gift was good. But if the only witnesses that were there were the ones who signed the deed, and they're too closely related to each other to do that, then this gift is not a gift, and they're going to have to redo the whole process. Abaye raised an objection, but doesn't Abaye is objecting again. Rav Yosef revised his ruling to accord with Abaye. Now what's Abaye going to say? Abaye says, but doesn't Rabbi Abba say that Rabbi Elazar concedes with regard to a document whose falsification is inherent in it, that the deed is not valid, despite the fact that it was properly transferred? In other words, although the signatures on a legal document are unnecessary insofar as affecting the transaction is concerned, you could do it without a document. But now that we have a document that includes invalid signatures and therefore is not valid, and this is in order to prevent others from relying upon these witnesses, so now we have a problem. So Rav Yosef said to the one holding the deed of gift, go away. The rabbis do not let me give you the gift. You're going to have to do it over with two witnesses who are not related to each other. I'm sorry, I should have warned you. The end is in sight. We're now done. I'm going to take some questions and comments. While this document reloads, if there are any other questions or comments, get them in now. Not easy stuff to keep track. Hopefully, I've made it as clear as I could. Reload, please. Here we go. Okay. Joe asks, at what level in the family tree are the cousins not excluded, right? Not disqualified? Would it be second cousins? Right. Members of the third generation with respect to each other, because they're not, obviously brother and sister or first cousins. But now in the third generation, you could have second cousins. In fact, I don't even know if you can have the third generation. You have to go to the fourth generation to have second cousins, and it seemingly would be permitted to testify against each other. But like I said, you definitely want to check with your local Orthodox rabbi on that. Guy, these are some of the most engaging passages, learning about the pecking order and how highly I should regard my relatives. LOL. Very good. I like it. Sharon, I think of my dad's shtetl, right? The town that her dad came from in the old country. It was small, and it seemed they were all somehow or another remotely related. I don't think anyone could have been a witness against anyone. That would be the issue, exactly. Lucy, it seems to me a huge family bubble is created so that if abuse, murder, theft occur within a family, it may be impossible to bring the matter to court for lack of valid witnesses. Now that's a very serious issue and a real concern. I wonder how they're going to deal with that, right? Because we certainly, on the one hand, especially what you're talking about is rape, right? You could be talking about rape, abuse, which basically is rape, and that could be a death penalty offense. Now, a court is going to be very reluctant to issue a death penalty. But are they going to thereby enable continuing abuse? Terrible outcome. Can't be that that's what God intended for us. So let's see how we're going to deal with that when we actually get to that area. It's a great question. I look forward to understanding it. And Rei Mechutanim, I said my Mechutanin, right, is the father of my son, my daughter-in-law's father, right? So if our children marry each other, that's a Mechutanan relationship, plural Mechutanim. And Sharon says that's Yiddish, not Hebrew. Thank you so much, Sharon. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday, regular time. Lots going on in the country tomorrow. Will be a good time to keep up our learning as we always do. All the best and have a great night.